Hello everybody, welcome back to a brand new landscape photography vlog. We are here at Evangola State Park, and it is that time of year where we're getting plenty of seasonal waterfalls that happen at 18 Mile, and it's happening here at Evangola as well. This also means plenty of opportunities for unique photos that you can only get at this point in the year when we have lots of rain, snowfall, and with that snow melt as well. Now today's video is going to be pretty short. I really just want to talk about the importance of using a polarizing filter, especially for scenes like this. So right now I'm going to switch over to the view from my camera right here, and as you can see, again, we have this really nice seasonal waterfall in front of us, and you can just see the difference here between polarized and unpolarized. So right now we are unpolarized, and we have a lot of reflections and a lot of highlights on the leaves, and you can kind of see that the color in these fallen oak leaves is not as punchy as it could be. And I find a lot of times it's really easy to overlook just how distracting a lot of these extra highlights and all this extra glare can be when you're taking a photo like this, right? We want the subject to be the waterfall, the details underneath the water, and the really crisp color in these fallen oak leaves. So when we go ahead and start to polarize it here, what happens is we start to get a lot of detail back from underneath the water's surface, and all of those really annoying highlights and reflections left on pretty much everything, the rocks, the leaves, etc., just all start to vanish. And I don't know why, but the polarizing filter helps to bring in a little bit more vibrance back into the scene, which I think saves you time in post and just makes everything just to look a little bit more punchy, which is nice, especially on a day like today where it's kind of drab, overcast, really not a whole lot of color to be brought out, so the polarizer does a good job at that. So that's one of the importances of using a polarizing filter, especially in woodland, where you have a lot of really hidden highlights that can, again, be easy to overlook and in the end cause a lot of distraction and kind of take away from the actual photo itself. And another thing too is that I am using a radial polarizing filter, which means I need to kind of twist it on the front of the lens here to play around with, seeing how it's actually polarizing. I don't know if they make polarizers that when you slap them on the lens, they're just 100% polarized. But when you have a radial one, you want to make sure that you're at max polarization so you can get the most out of it, which will require a little experimenting, a little fiddling with it. So I think I'm pretty much 100% polarized right now, and my settings are f11 at ISO 64. And another thing you'll notice too with a polarizer is it will just inherently darken the frame because you are putting more glass in front of the lens. So it kind of acts as a pseudo ND filter or neutral density filter, which in this case is actually going to help us out because we can get a lot longer of an exposure without having to crank the aperture up super high, which will induce chromatic aberration, diffraction, making the image overall look a little bit softer and less tack sharp. So I'm going to go ahead and focus on the waterfall in the background here. And again, I'm at f13 or f11, sorry. And I'm in aperture priority. Just always works the best for these types of scenarios. And 2-second delay on the shutter, and we'll just take it, focus on the waterfall back there. And it's a 13-second exposure, so it will take just a little bit here. And once that fires off, I'll show you quickly the unedited photo. So there it is. And I am going to do a focus stack as well. And just make sure I have all my bases covered. I'm going to focus on the rocks on the left here. And then once that wraps up, I'm going to do one more focus for the very bottom here where we have some nice white water and a nice little pool with some rocks underneath it that have some nice detail and nice color to them. And then after that, we're going to photograph this waterfall. That completes our focus stack with our polarizing filter. Yeah, let's take a look at this other waterfall here. So I've just set up my camera to photograph this second waterfall here, and we'll cut over to the video from this camera so you guys can see in real time sort of what the composition is going to look like. Now keep in mind, this is 16:9 aspect ratio instead of 2:3, so it's going to be a little bit cropped in. Not a true representation of the composition, but pretty close. So the way I have it set up here is that the waterfall itself and the white water It's kind of creating a nice diagonal throughout the entire frame. And I decided to not have any of the sky in this photo because I think it really doesn't add anything and it's more of a distraction. We want the waterfall to be kind of the main subject at the top of the frame as opposed to being just this big white patch of nothingness essentially. So that's why I've got the composition the way I do, and again, just a nice diagonal leading line all the way throughout. We've got some oak leaves on the side, and obviously the nice white water will look great with a long exposure, and we get to see all the details underneath the water because of the polarizer. So now I'm just going to go ahead and adjust the polarizer until I think it's 100% polarized, which sometimes can be the trickiest part, so you just kind of got to play around with it, and I think right about there is probably going to do it. And again, I think I'm going to go down to F10 and go up to actually ISO 100. I was at ISO 64, but the shutter doesn't need to be that super long, so I'm just cranking up the ISO just a tad to ISO 100. And again, I'm going to focus up there by the top waterfall and just press the shutter and wait. And then of course we are going to do a focus stack, so I'm going to focus here on these rocks on the left, just to make sure, again, I've covered all my bases and have everything in focus. And the last one, and that should do it. So one of my favorite things about this particular park is that it has access to the lake, and with that we have a beach. And one of my favorite things about beaches is that they're constantly in a state of change, especially this time of year with, rapid snow accumulation and snow melt and rain and just all sorts of terrible weather. You could come here one day and see something like this completely buried in the sand, and then the next day come back and it's unburied and it's moved 10 feet down the beach, all things like that. So you just really never know what you're going to get, and it creates a lot of possibilities to grab unique photos. And I've shot a lot here during the spring and summer and into the fall, and I've been feeling kind of burnt out on this location because this is a pretty small park compared to some place like Letchworth. But this is that time of year where things start to change, and they change rapidly, and I'm pretty excited about that. And one thing in particular is, again, this piece of driftwood here, I've photographed, I think, once or twice. I know one photo that I posted, it's called Lakeside Observer, and this piece of driftwood was way over here, probably about the entire length of this piece, again, all the way over to the side. And now I come here for the first time in a couple months, and it's shifted down this way, and it's 80% of it is buried under sand, which is kind of cool. And over here we have another tree that the last time I tried to photograph it, 90% of it was submerged in water. So the tide is also really low right now, so we have access to some cool features that you don't normally get access to. And that also, again, opens up some great opportunities. And there's one other thing I want to talk about too, is how you can kind of get more interesting photos on a day like today, where it was supposed to be forecasted a really great sunset, and I don't think we're getting that, judging by the intense cloud cover on the horizon. But I'm going to show you guys a way that you can kind of take a dull day like this and try to get something interesting out of it, even if the conditions are pretty miserable, right? So we'll show you guys that in a minute, but I do want to walk over here and take a look at this other feature. So here's that cool feature I was talking about. It is an oak tree, and judging by the leaves, looks to be a red oak, and it is completely buried in the sand. And again, like last time, I said that I was shooting a sunset here, which I actually have still not edited those photos, but this was shifted almost 90 degrees that way, and the tide was up far enough to the point where a large majority of this trunk here was in the water. So again, this is just another example of why I just love these beach scenes, because you never know how things are going to change over the course of a couple weeks. And I just love how these leaves stay on the tree even though it's past fall. Oak trees are pretty unique in the fact that they keep most of their leaves after the fall. It's called marcescence, and the reason why that happens is debated, but it's pretty cool. Pretty cool. And I'm just trying to figure out how I could possibly incorporate this into a photo. I'm kind of struggling, so we might save it for another day. The only thing I was possibly thinking about doing is maybe some kind of pano, but I feel like maybe it would just be a little too messy, a little too busy. Might not work out. So I think what we're going to do is move on to a little technique you can do to try to make dull, uninteresting scenes look a little bit more interesting. So let's go do that. So my current camera settings are f8 at ISO 100 at a 6-second metered exposure, since we are an aperture priority. And basically what I'm trying to do is do a bunch of long exposures and use Photoshop to load them all into a stack and use a certain blending mode to basically give us the look of a super long exposure. I was going to put on my ND filters, but I figured that might be a little overkill, and I didn't want to spend the extra time setting those up since they are a little finicky. But that's basically the gist. In a situation like this where I wanted to get a photo of this particular rock formation called Farnham Point, the only way I could really think about to make it interesting on a day like today, where we have no colors and there's a little bit of texture in the clouds, is again by doing a very long exposure. And there's a couple ways you can do that. You can either do what I'm doing by taking a bunch of short exposures and stacking them together in Photoshop, or you can do one really long exposure in field by using an ND filter. And doing it this way, you know, either with a filter or doing it in post, you kind of prevent yourself from having to go up to like f18 or f16, which again has negative side effects. I was trying to do like 15-second exposure at f11 at ISO 64, but again I changed the settings so I could get more relatively shorter exposures to kind of piece together, as opposed to a bunch of longer ones that aren't really going to look any better, and I can get more photos taken in a shorter period of time. So that's why I'm doing it the way I'm doing it. And also the water looks kind of cool too with the long exposure. So we'll show you guys what this looks like once it's all wrapped up in post. So I just wrapped up with those long exposures. I think I probably got enough. Don't need a ton. One thing I should emphasize, you probably want to at least have like 10 to 20 total. That should be enough to give you a simulated long exposure in post. And once we get back into post, I'll show you guys how we can take a photo like that just a step further to make it look a little bit more interesting. So I'll see you guys back in the studio. Also, how do you guys like the new mic? I love it. I like that I don't have to shout for the camera to hear me, and that I can be absurdly far away from the camera and you guys can also still hear me like I'm standing right next to it. So I love that. I like that a lot. Here we are back in the studio, and really quickly I want to walk you guys through the process of how you would do a simulated long exposure in post like I talked about. Now we also do have our sort of manual in-camera long exposure here. This one was 15 seconds at f11, and I think I was able to go a little bit longer than that by going up to f18. Yeah, right here. So this was f18. Again, we do have a little bit of diffraction, making things a little bit softer and those far off details there. And that was at 30 seconds. And we do have some movement in the clouds there. We just go to like Adobe Landscape, quickly just do the auto setting, which does a decent job at sometimes. I'd probably add a little bit more contrast to this. and bring the whites down, bring those highlights down a little bit, bring the blacks up a little bit, introduce some dehaze, and you can honestly even do like a black and white with this. I think would look really, really nice. I don't think the auto does a super good job there, but you know, I think black and white could really work with this. But you know, this is the in-camera long exposure at 30 seconds without using an ND filter, and honestly, it doesn't look too bad. I think it looks pretty good for what, you know, we had to work with. I think, again, getting that texture in the clouds, getting some of that movement, really smoothing out the water. We have some of that ghosting around the edges out here, and, you know, some ghosting in the waves. Looks kind of nice, but let's kind of compare it to our simulated, or I guess in post long exposure. So all of these photos are highlighted in green here are basically all of those shorter 5 to 6 second exposures I was taking back to back on the beach. Now, I knew this was going to happen, and it did happen. The tide was coming in, and it was kind of washing over one of the legs of my tripod, and it caused the tripod to move. So we can't use some of the photos after a certain point because I'm pretty sure the tripod kept moving. But I was able to select at least 15 of these photos, which are the ones that I have selected here. And this was before the camera ended up moving. And as you can see, I did a quick little edit to all of these and applied it to all of them just by going on the first one, hitting develop settings, copy settings, and then selecting the rest of them, hitting develop settings, paste settings. So that gives each photo a uniform look, and that's exactly what we want. So the next step from here would be to hit export and go over to export, and we're going to select a folder. We're going to make a separate folder that we want to export these files into. If you already have like a temp folder or something like that, you can just go ahead and use that. But I created a folder on the desktop just called Farnham Point Long Exposure, and that's where all of these are going to go into. I am going to export them as TIFFs, which I think is perfect. Normally I would do 16 bits. You want to do 16-bit if it is a portfolio shot or something you plan on printing, right? But for this, just an example, I'm going to just do 8 bits, and we're going to do nothing here after the export, and just leave it as is. And then at this point, we're just going to hit export, and this will take a little bit if your computer is a little older, and especially at 16 bits as well. So we're just going to export these, and we'll go from there. Now that all of our photos have finished exporting, we're going to open up Adobe Photoshop, go up here into the top left, click File, Scripts, and hit Load Files into Stack. Now at this point, we're going to hit Browse and select the folder that we just exported all of these photos into, and select all of them. So there they are. Just Command A or Control A to select them all. And then we're going to hit Create Smart Object after loading layers. Importantly, don't forget to do that. And then we're going to hit OK. And Photoshop is basically going to take all 25 layers and condense them into one singular layer, which will be a smart object, which means we can basically change its blending mode and any filters we apply to it at any point in the editing process, and helps to kind of create a what is called a non-destructive workflow. So now that it has done doing that, we're going to go up to Layer and select the Smart Objects tab, scroll down to Stack Mode, and we're going to select Mean. And this is going to change, again, the way that these 25 photos are stacked together, the way that they are blended together. Right now, it's basically just showing us the top photo, the top long exposure, as it was shot in camera. You know, it doesn't look too crazy or anything like that, although I actually love the way the water looks. I think the water looks incredible. But the sky, right, it could be a little bit softer, a little streakier. So let's see what mean does. There's also the median blending mode, which we can compare to once this is done to see which of the two we end up liking better. So yeah, here is mean. And I think the water still looks pretty good, but if we go ahead and take a detailed look at the sky here, we can see we have what looks to be the lines and streaks that you'd get from a very long exposure, maybe like a couple minutes at least, and it just looks really, really nice. And I filmed this earlier, and the trees were looking really blurry, and that kind of made me realize the fact that the camera had moved, because The only things that should be having a blur added to them were the things that moved. So that's what made me go back and check that out. So if you do something similar to this and you look at your foreground element that's supposed to be completely steady and it's very blurry, maybe you want to go back and check to see if your camera moved in Lightroom. So this is what the mean blending mode looks like. Let's go ahead and look at the other blending mode, which is going to be the median blending mode. So we're going to select that. Photoshop's going to do its magic, and we'll see what this looks like in comparison to the mean blending mode. So here is the median blending mode. Now I think you can already tell just by looking at the sky that it really didn't do a good job with this. So we're going to easily just hit Command Z or Control Z to go back to the other blending mode. And there we have it. There is our simulated long exposure. Now we can go back to Lightroom and compare it with our F18. There's the F18 long exposure in camera, where again we have that softness just from being at F18 compared to the simulated long exposure, which was shot, I believe, collectively at F8. So we're going to get a lot sharper of a photo just by being at F8 compared to F18. And again, it's personal preference. Whichever one you decide to like better is going to be entirely up to you in the end. We can just go here, add photo filter, and start messing around with all these values here. And again, just seeing which one we like better, right? We can play around with all these different colors, really make that sky look super dramatic, something like that. And then we can add a curves to kind of bring up the shadows a little bit, maybe dip down the highlights, or maybe just add some contrast overall. Almost forgot how to do basic S-curve there for a second. But yeah, something like that. And then we can just do like, our luminosity masks, which I do have an action for. And we can just maybe bring up the shadows by going to a curves in the shadows layer and bringing those values up or even down, right? And just again, create a super moody, dramatic photo. And again, whatever you want to do from this point is completely up to you. And really quickly, before we wrap this video up, I do want to walk you guys through briefly the editing process on one of those seasonal waterfalls that we shot with the polarizing filter. And of course, we did a focus stack on that as well. Now, if you guys want me to do a detailed video on focus stacking, I'm happy to do that. And I'll probably end up doing one regardless, because it is a little bit tricky to understand at first, especially when it comes to blending some things together in Photoshop when you have really complex scenes like this, where you got to really find those fields of focus and blend them properly. Of course, you could have Photoshop do it automatically, but I think it does a terrible job. So you'll have to, bear with my weird masks over here on the right. But yeah, here was our focus background, midground, and foreground. And the midground was mainly for these rocks here on the left. And I'm really glad I did that, because you can see the difference when we add that focus midground in. It really pops those rocks and all those details out and gets them nice and sharp. And then our focus foreground, yeah, I tend to do it like background first, then midground, then foreground. I usually don't have a midground. It's usually just like background and foreground. But this is one of those photos that I guess kind of called for both, essentially. So yeah, if I toggle on just the background here without the other stacks, you can see this is not in focus. I mean, it kind of is, but it's not sharp. And same thing with down here with these leaves. Again, these are not super tack sharp either. And this was also at F11 too, so we had a much wider depth of field. But when we toggle all those on and we blended them in properly, we get all of that sharp detail back. So we get a very sharp image all the way throughout. And yeah, combined all the layers together here, and then added a Color Effects Pro layer, which is a great plugin from Nik Collection by Google. At least I think it's still by Google, I'm not sure, but I think it's DxO. But yeah, they do a great job. It's a great plugin. I'd highly recommend it. I did some dodge and burn here on the white water, and you can kind of see just before and after, help to kind of define that. I did a little global mid-tone contrast here by using some luminosity masks. I did a little gamma reduction here in the highlights on some of those leaves on the left and right because I thought they were a little too bright. So I wanted to tone those down a little bit to make them a little less distracting. And then for the blue channel, here did a little blue reduction hue saturation layer in mainly just this water up here. So you can see I toggle it on and off. You can see the water has a slight blue tint to it. But obviously it's white in reality, so I wanted to go ahead and clear that out just with a blue reduction layer. And then here I took a little bit of an artistic license and kind of darkened the surroundings of the waterfall to help the waterfall and the little stream that it created, you know, to stand out a little bit more as the subject and the focus of this photo. And I think it did a great job at doing that. Added a high pass filter, which is just some general sharpening on everything that wasn't the water, which is supposed to be soft, and added a signature, and that is the entire edit. We'll do one little before and after. I think it's a great improvement. I hope you guys think the same, and I'll be sharing this photo on my socials, and it'll be up on my website shortly as well. Hope you guys learned something, and thanks for watching.